well. If you cannot hear me at any time, if you just raise your hand, not with your card in your hand, but if you just raise your hand, I will try to speak a little louder. Also, we'll have a summary of tonight's talk on these sheets. If you cannot see them, perhaps there's a way you could move around a little bit to see the chart better as well. So feel free to do that, but again, just wear your mask if you are moving about. And I suppose we'll get started if Lee is ready. And so, what we're going to talk about tonight in geology, we're going to look at the big picture, we're going to break it down, and then we're going to build it back up. So first we're going to look at the mountains. Well, why are there mountains? Where do they come from? So that's what we'll explore first. And then we'll move down to rocks, a little bit smaller version. Where do the rocks come from? And what is the difference between an intrusive rock and an extrusive rock? Then we're going to break that down further into minerals. And we're going to look at the mineral versus rock distinctions. We're going to look at 4 specific minerals. We're going to look at quartz, we'll look at feldspar, mica, and hornblende. Then we're going to take those minerals and build them back up into rocks. So the 3 types of rocks we will explore are basalt, which is an extrusive rock, granite, and the pegmatites, which come off of the granite, and those are intrusive rocks. We'll look at the distinctions between basalt and granite, and then we'll look at the distinctions between granite and a pegmatite. And then when we look at the granite pegmatites, that's where we'll have some fun. That's where the main gems come from, and we're going to look at where do they occur, and what is the age, perhaps, of those granites and pegmatites. And then finally, regarding the main gems, I'm going to mention some local famous names, last names in mineralogy. I'll give you the best references for minerals and gems found in the pegmatites of Oxford County. And finally, we'll look at some uses for quartz, feldspar, mica, and by the way, has everyone here visited the Maine Mineral and Gem Museum up in Bethel? Let me see a show of hands. It's a wonderful resource to have so close to home, and I strongly encourage you to go visit that. There are lots of beautiful gems up there. All right, so why are there mountains and where do they come from? Well, let's take a look at plate tectonics. Mountain building results from, and my van over here will show that. So with the plate tectonics, mountain building results from huge slabs of continental plates, not these represented by these paper plates, of Earth's crust as they slide over the surface of the globe. Now if you imagine gigantic ice floes in the polar sea coming together while the ocean separating them steadily shrinks. As 2 plates approach each other, the accumulated sand and mud, now this is thousands of feet thick, on the bordering shallow margins of those continental plates are crumpled and deformed.
So I'm just going to add a little there. So what I'm trying to show is that as this big plate rammed into North America, all that sediment right here is pushed up onto North America and compressed. In southwestern Maine, those sediments that were in the bottom of the ocean were up to 9 miles thick. So I want you just to remember, as we get into this, because this is going to be important as to why we have the minerals we have, all those oceanic sediments that are compressed, what do ocean sediments have in them? Ocean water, a lot of water, and a lot of dissolved ions and a lot of other stuff, rich in nutrients. And that's going to get into what we're going to talk about later. So if we can remember, this was a time of unity. This big thing hitting this thing was called Pangea, when they were all stuck together like this, about 350 million years ago. So that's where we are now. We got all that sediment smashed up on North America, compressed down, and it's full of all that material that was in the ocean.
Right. So as Brian said, now around 50 million years ago, the continental plate that now encompasses the country of India pushed into the Eurasian continental plate. The buckling crust shoved rocks up into the continent to form the Himalayan mountains. Then 300 million years ago, Brian's going to show you because he has the 2 that specifically formed the Appalachian chain. So those mountains were formed, and they include some mountains in Maine, by the way, when North America, the continent we now know as North America, collided with Gondwana, which was a continental plate, which we now know as Africa and South America.
So they've collided, they've piled the sediments on top, and they've made this giant continent called Pangaea that we just talked about. And all this occurred about 350 million years ago.
Give or take. You know, we're thinking in geologic time, which is a difficult concept to wrap your head around. So as these plates are coming together, it's not a crash like two cars meeting head on. It's a very, very slow process. And to that end, some mountains are still growing and some are eroding. The Himalayas are still growing because that crashing between, between Eurasia and India is still happening. So the Himalayas are still getting taller and the Appalachian chain is eroding. And what causes that erosion? Well, it's going to be wind and rain and temperature changes. And as rocks break off, we can actually tell their history from that. So eventually the sediments and the minerals that make up rocks end up on the ocean seafloor where they return to the beginning of the rock cycle. We're not going to get into really an in-depth discussion on the rock cycle, but just to know that they go back. So subsequently they're subjected to changes in temperature and pressure, and again they become part of an extrusive or intrusive rock. An example of an extrusive rock would be basalt, an intrusive rock would be granite. And to that end, Brian's going to explain a little bit more about the plutons and how, you know, we don't have the Appalachian chain right here, but we have plenty of rocks. We have mountains, we have hills around here that we're all climbing. Evans Notch is not, you know, part of that. So we have these nice mountains. Well, where did they come from? So Brian's going to talk a little bit more about plutons for us.
So we've smashed together these continents, and we have driven a lot of material deep into the earth. That material begins to melt. So the pattern of all those rocks that were smashed onto Maine are all these green striped rocks here. This is the area just north of here. Once you've pushed all that down under there with all that water in it, way down there it begins to melt, it begins to mobilize. And bubbling up through some of these metamorphic rocks will be these bodies of granite. So some of you have probably heard of the Sebago batholith. It's a big wedge of granite going down through here. These pink areas all through here, and Sebago would go all the way down there. That's all this material that was driven deep into the earth. It's remelted and it started to move and inject itself into the surrounding metamorphic rock. And you'll see this pattern going all the way from Maine all the way down to Alabama, where you have these layers of metamorphic rock with these plutons injected into it. And these plutons, as we remember, are being formed in an area with a lot of metamorphic rock and a lot of water and a lot of ions. And Mary's going to talk a little bit about the formation of granite. I think we're going to get to that in a minute.
Right.
But we're going to explain a little bit about why you can see, this is why, as we look around here, Maine has a lot of these granite bodies injected up into here. And that's going to be important as to why there's so many minerals and why they're so widespread over this area of Maine and going up north. Any questions? This will be available to look at, but it gets kind of, I don't want to get too much deeper than that right now.
And incidentally, if you do have a question, you're welcome to stop us, or you can save them till the end if you feel more comfortable with that. All right, so moving right along, we're going to talk about minerals. Well, what is a mineral? Well, minerals are to a rock what bricks are to a wall, okay? Now, I'm just going to show you just a couple little things here first. So I take this little item here, and just a show of hands, is this a stone? Is it a rock? Or is it a mineral? Any guesses? Let me see stone. Any hands for stone? How about rock? Stone? Rock? Is this a rock? Or is it a mineral? Yes, the majority said mineral. You guys are good geologists already. So, how about this? Let's move a little bit larger. Is this a stone? Show of hands. rock, mineral. Okay, good job. It's a mineral again. So now Brian has a larger one. Now what is that? Is that a stone? A rock? Any show of hands for a rock? Rock? Okay. Any hands for a mineral? You guys, you're nailing it already. Then he's going to go a little bit larger. Now we're going to try to trick you. How about this big piece? Is that a stone? Rock? Mineral. Okay. Well, it was a bit of a trick question because all of these are one mineral. So it doesn't depend on the size. This is a piece of quartz, but so is this. Whoops. So is this. So they get a little bit larger, larger, and larger. So, but if it's all one thing, it's a mineral. Hence the description here of what a mineral is. So you guys were great on that. So this is the scientific definition of a mineral. It's a naturally occurring solid, inorganically formed. It has a definite chemical composition and proportion. And lastly, it is in crystalline form. If you look at these, you can see crystals in that quartz. And that is, they're in a highly ordered atomic arrangement of a few kinds of atoms in a unique and unchanging pattern for each mineral. So, let me let you know that there are several thousand natural minerals that exist. But fortunately, only a few are found in the rocks we're likely to encounter. A few minerals have economic value because of the metals or other substances that we can extract from them, and we'll get to that at the end of the talk. And a very few are valuable as gemstones. So we've given you the definition of a mineral, and we've seen some. And now the rock is very simply made up of one or more minerals. So the rock at least gets an easy definition out of all that. So now we're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about 4 different minerals: quartz, feldspar, mica, and hornblende. And this is where the audience gets to play along. So let's talk about quartz first. It seems like I started writing really big, and then I said, oh, I'm going to run out of room. Had to cut it down there a little bit. So quartz, it's a very, very simple mineral. As you look at this, whether you look at this piece or the piece that Brian's going to hold up, it's very simple. It just, it's all one uniform in color and the like. Okay. It contains only 2 atoms. And here's where I need my participation. Everyone has an index card. And when I call that out, if you feel comfortable standing up with your card, that's okay. But if you'd rather sit and just hold your card up, you can show everyone that you have that certain atom in your mineral. So it contains only 2 types of atoms. Silicon. Is it silicon in the house? Okay, hold that up. Silicon and oxygen. Oxygen. Okay, now we've made quartz. Where's quartz? There we go. We have the silicon and the oxygen, and we've made some quartz.
So I have a question to ask on that. This rock probably weighs 2 pounds. How much of that weight is due to oxygen? Just a guess, roughly percentage-wise.
25%.
So quartz, the chemical formula is 1 silicon and 2 oxygen. So this rock, when you go by weight percent, oxygen is 53% of the weight of a quartz mineral. Silicon is 47%. And so one thing that I've always found to be really interesting when I'm standing on the rocks of the crust of the earth is that the atom that is most common in the crust of the earth, 46% by weight in the whole crust, is oxygen. But the rocks we're going to be standing on tomorrow on our little hike are mostly by weight oxygen. That's what you're standing on when you're walking around the crust of the earth. It's mostly oxygen.
Yes, and because it has 2 oxygens per silicon, it's the most abundant of all minerals, quartz is. And it accounts to about 10 to 40% of our minerals found in granite. Okay? It's very, very hard. There's a scale called a Mohs scale, and it's number 7 on the Mohs scale. And it is so hard, it's 2 too hard to be scratched with a knife, and it will scratch glass. Okay, let's move on to our next mineral. So let's go to feldspar. Before we get into the two varieties, let's just talk about what basic feldspar is made from. It consists of two atoms to start. Silicon. Where's silicon? Silicon and oxygen.
You were popular.
And we're going to add a third one in now, aluminum. Is there an aluminum in the house?
Aluminum over there.
Okay, so now we have silicon, oxygen, and aluminum. But we're going to make it a little more complicated because there are two varieties of feldspar. If we add in potassium, is there potassium in the house? Now keep your silicon and your oxygen and your aluminum up because they're all still in here. And now we're adding the potassium. And so now we have orthochlorate. And that gives granite a nice pinkish look. And Brian's going to hold up several samples of that. And then you can put your cards down. Give your arms a break a bit. Okay? So we have a large sample there and some smaller samples. You'll see the really pink crystals in that. Then the other one. So now we go to plagioclase. Well, what is it going to have in it? Well, it's going to have silicon. Silicon? I'm keeping you awake. Oxygen, yes. Aluminum. And instead of adding potassium, we're going to add sodium, and calcium. Okay, there we go, great. So that's going to occur in shades of gray to black, and that's also found in granite.
So, just a slight distinction there. So you guys over there with the sodiums and calcium, the granites that come from that tend to look more whitish. It actually has a name called a diorite. You'll hear that around this area a lot. But it's still the same thing, quartz. This one has quartz with potassium feldspar, and this has quartz with the sodium or the calcium. It just makes a slight variation in color. I think of diorites as being kind of a salt and pepper look. And it's easy to think of that because sodium, right? So you get that kind of whitishness in there because of the sodium.
Question?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. With the orthoclase or case bar, like if I'm opening up a peg, sometimes I'll get the salmon color, and then I come back a week later and it's cream. So I know there's a drying process that changes the color, but are there other reasons why the color changes?
Why would we change from pink to white?
I'm not sure because no, not really, because potassium feldspar is a very durable mineral.
Yeah.
You'll see some of the slopes around here that have been scraped by the glacier, and 10,000 years later you look down and it's the perfect crystal face of a piece of potassium feldspar. So it shouldn't react as fast as what you're describing, so I'm not really sure what's going on.
If it had that salmon color, what would it be instead? It's got the right angles for the cleavage and all that.
I'm not sure, I'd have to see this. But I guess I'm just getting to a potassium feldspar that makes these granites. Actually is a very durable mineral. So it shouldn't react that fast. So I'm not really sure what it's going. It's turning white.
Yeah, it's creamier.
Creamier. Yeah, I don't know exactly what's going on or what's reacting. I have to see the specimen. But as you know, granites are pretty darn durable, and it's pretty amazing to me. Like at the top of Sabatis, you can go out there and you can actually see where the glaciers left a couple of those scratches still in the feldspar. That's how durable and non-reactive it is. But that should be pretty resistant to that kind of reaction. So I think something else must be going on.
Yes, and to that end, these feldspars split or sever from rocks along flat, uniform faces. And if you'll come up and look in the pegmatite box, and that's mainly what we'll see tomorrow, you can see those crystals of feldspar in all of these pegmatites. Every one of them has some feldspar, either the sodium or the plagioclase or the orthoclase. So we have plenty of samples up here for you to take a peek at. All right, let's move on to our third mineral, mica. Okay, what is mica made up of? Guess what? Silicon and oxygen. Okay. Those are bonded to other atoms to form sheets, and we've seen this a lot. And they're bonded together in a weak pattern with the atoms of potassium. Is there a potassium in the house? There we go, potassium, allowing splitting into very thin flakes. And so you'll see that up here. If it's white or clear mica, it also contains aluminum. Where's our aluminum? So anyway, what happened to my silicon and oxygen and potassium. They have to stay here. Okay, so now we have our aluminum in there. And so that's called muscovite. And that's the subcategory of mica here. So that's white or clear because it contains the aluminum. And it could be pink, green, or even a brown. And then the second form of mica is biotite. Now that one will be black. But guess what it's going to have? Silicon. Oxygen. That's right. And potassium. And then what makes it black? Iron and magnesium. Iron, and how about a magnesium? Good job. So that's black, and we have some good samples of biotite up here for you to see too. And then we get to the last one, hornblende. I don't have good samples of that up here because we'd really need a hand lens to see that. Because what that does is it makes black needle-like crystals in granite. And we just don't happen to have them. However, we can talk about what it has in it, right? What does it have? Silicon, yes.
Oxygen.
And oxygen, that's right. And it's linked by iron and magnesium plus calcium, sodium, and aluminum. Woohoo! So a little more complicated. So in what rock that we might see on the walk tomorrow, for those of you who are joining us, in what rock might we see quartz, feldspar, mica, and hornblende? Any guesses? Granite, exactly. And the two major minerals that must be in granite are quartz and feldspar. Right, right. Now, let me flip this over here. We're finished with the minerals. And, okay. Now tomorrow we're going to explore 3 types of igneous rocks. Well, what does igneous mean? Well, igneous is a Latin word that means fire. And it's a reference to the fact that those rocks crystallize from molten or hot magma deep inside the earth. Igneous rock is divided on the basis of the mineral content. As we saw, all things are, right? They're based on the mineral content, into 2 major families, and they're distinguished by color. First, we have the basalt family, which is darker crystalline rocks with minerals rich in what? Iron and magnesium. Where's my iron and magnesium? There we go. And they are mostly dark green and black.
And one thing I want to add about basalt, because people hear it from me all the time, the mineral that you will never see in basalt is quartz, because there's not enough silica in here to make quartz. The silicon and the oxygen get used up building the other minerals in basalt. So basalt is what they call undersaturated with respect to quartz. So if you see a quartz crystal in something, it's not basalt.
Thank you, Brian. So then we move down to the granite family, which includes, of course, our pegmatites. They are lighter in color and in weight. Their major components are light-colored minerals. They have a high proportion of aluminum and potassium. There we go, great.
So one thing is continents are mostly made up of silicon and aluminum and those kind of minerals. The oceanic rocks, the basalts, are more iron and manganese. On the big scale, that means that these rocks are less dense than these rocks. And so as the continents collide with oceanic rocks, these dive underneath, because the continental crust is kind of floating because of density on top of all this. And that's kind of one of the fundamental ways continents grow, because as these oceanic plates dive under, they're sticking all that sediment on here. There's whole island arcs the size of Japan that get rammed on and slammed onto continents, because this is just kind of floating around on this chain of heavier iron-rich rocks that are diving underneath.
It makes sense that iron is heavy. Doesn't it seem heavy? You know, it seems intuitively correct. So just expanding while he has those 2 samples in his hand, expanding on what he explained, the basalt, put the other one down. No, yeah, the basalt, I'm sorry, you can have them both, but raise it higher. The basalt is an extrusive rock. What does that mean? That means it cooled above the ground. Think of a volcano, right? And it has fast cooling because it cooled above the ground, and that results in very small crystals in that basalt.
So just a little aside on that is that the basalts that we're going to see tomorrow didn't quite make it to the top of the ground. But they were injected into the rocks around here, and they cooled so quickly because they came into contact with this that they still have that fine-grained appearance. So it's still basalt, the same chemical thing. It just didn't quite make it up to the top of the ground. It has another name for it, but I don't want to get people confused with all these different names because it is the same rock as if it's just made at that little left bit.
Right. And then conversely, so that was the extrusive rock. Granite, now that sample that he held up with the granite, is an intrusive rock, and that cooled inside the earth in a pluton, as he talked about earlier, and that was slower cooling, and that resulted in much larger crystals. Yes?
Is basalt the oldest type of rock?
Oh, what a great question. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Because you see it injected and remelted into granite.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So,
And we can tell that from radiometric dating on rocks and that sort of thing, but Brian's going to take that because he loves to talk about when you look at all these rocks, which is younger, and we can explore that tomorrow.
Is basalt the oldest rock? So for most cases, all the oceanic bottoms of the oceans, because of the cycle of rocks and they're diving under the continents, they're being consumed, remelted, and cycled back. So most basalt on the earth is relatively young. The oldest rocks, it turns out, are the cores of the continents, like the cores of Australia. These kind of granites with old zircons and things in them that are almost 4 billion years ago. It was the original cooling scum on this earth as it started to cool off. So it can have some basalts in it, but most basalts are relatively young because they're being recycled as they dive under the continent. And it's those cores of the continents, the inside, up like Wisconsin or Minnesota or the Canadian Shield or the inside of Australia that have the oldest rocks, because they're kind of in the middle, kind of spinning around as the world is like diving underneath them with plates and things are accreting onto them. So the oldest rocks aren't really the basalt. Does that make sense?
Okay, let me flip this over, and I think we come to the busiest sheet of the night. Oh, we do. Yes, we do. But I wanted to show you the distinctions between the basalt and the granite. I won't belabor this too much, but there are a few things I wanted to point out. Why is that basalt darker? So we have darker versus lighter. This is darker because of that iron and magnesium. Iron and magnesium over here somewhere.
Same thing that we saw with the biotite and the muscovite. More iron makes a darker rock for the most part. More aluminum makes a lighter colored rock.
So the basalt is fine-grained, whereas the granite is coarse-grained. So a big distinction there. And you'll see that if you look closely at that. Now the basalt is basic in nature, whereas the granite is acidic in nature. And we all remember the pH scale with, basic and acidic. And if you have any questions on that, we'll explain that. The basalt, as Brian said earlier, you can look all day. There's no quartz in there. And if you do find quartz, you don't have a basalt. Yet, equal or more than 20% in granite, they have at least 20% of the feldspar and the quartz in here. And those two things are required, remember, for our granite. Their origin is the same, however. They both come, you notice this first line, they both come from magma. But the basalt comes out from lava that finds its way up to Earth's surface through fissures and cracks underneath the Earth's surface. And that forms either a sill or a dike shooting up. And you've seen that probably even if you drive down through Poland and you see where they've cut the rock out for Route 26 to go through there. You can see, if you look to the side, you can see those basaltic dikes going up in there. You can also see it locally on Keewaydin Lake. There's something that's called locally picnic rock, and that is a huge outcropping that has basaltic dikes, and actually some that of different ages, where some came in and some came later and cross-cut that. You can see that by canoe or kayak. You can also get there by land, but it is now on private property, so you'd have to ask permission to do that. And I have some information on, if anyone is interested in that striped ledge on Keewaydin Lake, I have some more information on that. Now that dates back to the Jurassic period. We have it right here in our neighborhood. I think that's amazing that it's lasted that long for us to see. And the land trust, we did a walk out there, I guess about a year and a half ago. But it's fascinating though to see that. So the only other thing, and I'd like to read some of this, we've already been over the extrusive versus inclusive. I want to point out that the basalt splits along a columnar plane, whereas the granite splits along a horizontal plane. We're not going to be splitting rocks. We know that these are darker, these are lighter. And the one thing I want to point out, though, is that this basalt is mostly occurring on that ocean floor. Remember how he said it took a dive down, right? And the granite makes up most of the Earth's crust. So just some more distinctions between those two. Everyone understands what magma is when I'm talking about magma. It's molten earth. Okay, so that's the difference between granite and basalt. How about the difference between granite and a pegmatite? Because this talk is about the pegmatites. We finally got to it. So it's about the pegmatites of Oxford County. And this one is pretty straightforward. Granite has the feldspar, quartz, mica, and some gem minerals in it. It has the same minerals in the pegmatite, and they are often attached to one another, as Brian will show you. So we have some great samples here of the granite with a pegmatite attached to it.
Granite being here, and this is a pegmatite over here.
So you see how very, very coarse that pegmatite is, but it has the same minerals in it.
And more.
Yes, yes, exactly. So wherever you find a pegmatite, there will be granite. But everywhere you find granite, there's not necessarily a pegmatite. So it is a little bit of a reverse thing there. And then one other thing I'll point out, because this is all pretty straightforward, is that the pegmatites were originally associated with a water cavity. Well, that's interesting, because the granite is not. And Brian will explain a little bit, where does this water come from? And why did the pegmatites take over that water cavity?
So we talked a bit about plutons and how they were formed at the base of this huge mountain chain that used to be here. And as that granite, this kind of material here, is very uniform, very small crystals. The quartz starts forming, the silicon and the oxygen, the feldspar starts, the mica. Well, there's no room for water in this. So the water starts getting pushed out towards the edges of these big granite plutons. And along with that, other ions that didn't fit in here, lithium, beryllium, other kinds of small minerals, they all get pushed out of this big mass of cooling granite. So we now get to the edges of these big plutons. Similar to this area of Oxford County is the edge of the Sebago pluton. All that water, superheated, rich in ions, is now in pockets with all this stuff, and all of a sudden they start to crystallize really rapidly, because now they're somewhere with all their friends and they're like, yeah, it's us now, let's go. And when they start to crystallize, they crystallize very fast with very large interlocking crystals. And one mineral we haven't talked about is tourmaline. I believe that's up here on the front.
Yes.
I want you to remember tourmaline, because it is an extraordinary mineral, because it is made from the leftovers of these granite plutons and all this metamorphism. All that stuff, superheated, pressed into these water pockets, is going to make these extraordinary minerals that we're seeing right around the edge of this big pluton. So just as a quick aside, because I find it really kind of fascinating, this looks pretty solid, doesn't it? This granite? Well, what if you had a pluton that was 90 kilometers long and about 30 wide? It's called the Sebago pluton. About 40 years ago, for you old timers here, what did they want to do in the Sebago pluton? Do you remember?
Make an atomic place to store atomic material.
Yeah.
Exactly. 40 years ago, somebody said, look, a giant body of super solid granite. What a great place to dig a big hole and put all our radioactive waste, right? Well, it turns out it wasn't quite as thick or quite as solid as people thought. And when they actually got in there, they found that the Sebago pluton was about 1 kilometer thick, and it was kind of pushed up into all of this surrounding rock. And if anybody has a well around here like I do, at 425 feet down, guess what? I hit a fracture, it makes 170 gallons a minute. Not really the best place to put your radioactive waste. So that idea was great. Was decided not to be the best. Very good.
I remember it well.
You have a question?
Yeah, why do we have uranium in our water?
So, it's one of those minerals that's in, or atoms that's in a granite body. You have some small amounts of uranium, and it gets pushed out of some of the crystal matrices and into those fractures of water. That's why we have some uranium. And as uranium decays, one of the products down from that is another one, radon. So, yes, that's, as we talk about uranium, I want to bring back another thing. How do we know how old this rock is? Well, there are some minerals in here, one particular is called zircon, that when it's forming, it will take uranium into the mineral lattice. But it will not take lead. It just won't do it. It won't take the chemistry. And you know that uranium decays, and it decays at a certain rate over time. So this is what I did, not on this one, but I did a master's thing where I had to break those crystals out, isolate the crystals that had those radioactive materials in it, and then you look at the ratio of how much uranium is in there and how much lead is in there. And you can tell then that if the half-life of uranium is, one of them, radium-235, is 700 million years. So that if it's 50% uranium and 50% lead, you know that rock is 700 million years old, because that's the half-life of uranium. That's how they do absolute dating of these rocks, is looking for those little inclusions that have uranium in them. So these, when granites are forming, because remember we had all this oceanic rock pushed in there. It's rich in all kinds of ions and minerals that get isolated in. But that's why uranium is just incorporated in the melt of the rock to begin with.
So it's because it's in the granite around here that you're getting the uranium out of it?
Exactly. Granites do contain some amount of uranium, most of them, and that over time that will degrade into radon. But as these big fracture networks go through there, uranium ions are released into the water. We have uranium in the water at our house, and it's twice the drinking water level. And the way that we deal with it, it's not very sophisticated, but you know that little filter that's in your refrigerator for water? That will take out 95% of the uranium, that little filter in the refrigerator. So that's all I have to do, plus another little one under the sink. Anyway, good question. There's all kinds of interesting ions and minerals that will come, but uranium's kind of more distributed throughout this rock, and less pushed into those pockets of water like the pegmatite, because it gets incorporated into zircons and some other minerals into their little lattices, and then it slowly degrades over time. Anyway, good question.
Thank you. Okay, so where were we? Granite, pegmatite? Okay. So just to summarize, the granite and the pegmatites have the same minerals, but they differ in the amount of coarseness. And you can see that very clearly here. This is very fine grained, this is very coarse. So the distinguishing feature, though, is not quite the coarseness, but the irregularity of that grain. So if you had a big field of it, you'd look and you'd see maybe a 1-inch feldspar, and that could be right next to its neighbor, which is several feet long. So it's just very irregular. Whereas you look at the granite and it's pretty uniform. But when you come up and look at the pegmatites, you'll see there's no uniformity about that. Okay. So we're getting close here. So where do these pegmatites come from? This is the pegmatites here. Where do these come from? Here it is attached to some granite. Where do they come from? Well, they travel, they really run pretty much northeast from Alabama to New York, and then east-northeast up into Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. Now, Maine's commercial deposits occur mostly in Cumberland, Sagadahoc, Lincoln, Androscoggin, and of course, Oxford County. So, again, here we look at what the pegmatites, these rough ones that are attached to the granite, what do they consist of? We have some light colors, we have some dark colors. So, let's go to the light colors first. Is there a feldspar in the audience? We have a feldspar. How about a quartz? I know quartz is here somewhere. And we have a muscovite. We haven't had a muscovite splash us yet. Yes, there we go, great. So those are the lighter colors in the pegmatites. And we also have the dark colors, the biotites. Is there a biotite here? Great. And black tourmaline. Black tourmaline, anyone? Who has the black tourmaline? Oh, sorry. Okay, good. That gives us the, and they could include some of the gems that are found in Maine. Some magnetite, some green, opaque beryl and garnet and the like. So, anyone know in the crowd, anyone happen to know what Maine's state mineral is? What is the state mineral of Maine? Any guesses? Tourmaline, very close. And everyone I've asked tonight has said that. Well, it's black tourmaline. Black tourmaline, wave, yeah, your Maine state mineral. All right. And then finally, I just wanted to wrap up with some of the uses, because you might think, well, it's great to have all the, well, we know what the uses of the gems are. I happen to have a piece of amethyst from Puriams around my neck. I happen to have a piece of pink tourmaline on my finger, so that if people wanted to see what those look like, they could. But what are we using these things for? And I always find that fascinating. So what do we use the feldspars for? So part of the interesting thing, it's used in pottery and enamelware. It's part of porcelain. Interestingly, it's part of artificial teeth. So that's your feldspar. It's coarse, so it's in scouring soaps and window washes. It's used as fertilizer. A lot of people have heard of potash, feldspar, right, for fertilizer. Looking at the quartz, well, you see how good it would be for glass, and they use it for sandpaper, pottery, and glass. Use it as an abrasive, because once you break that down, those crystals are pretty coarse. It's in paints, and it's as a wood filler. And if you break quartz down enough, it's the sand you walk in at the beach. And then lastly, we have mica, and that's used for paperweights, because it's got that, the glassy appearance to it. Interestingly enough, it's been used for windows in coal, gas, and oil stoves. And you've probably seen that. Lampshades and wallpaper to give it that shiny.
Oh yes.
Shiny pattern.
There's a store. Oh, I can't remember their name now. They sell antique stoves and stuff, but you also can send away. They package it up. You can buy all the mica you need.
Wow.
But a lot of it's for the wood stove.
Oh, sure.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Yeah, you
can
bet.
still buy it.
Oh,
It's
that's wonderful.
inexpensive.
That's good to know. And then as a lubricant and in fancy paints when you want some glitter. And I always found this fascinating that it's in makeup. So, if you put blush on your cheek or eyeshadow on it has glitter, or even your lipstick has a little bit of glitter to it, that's mica.
It's what drew me to being a geologist, by the way. I really enjoyed that lab. Oh yes, it's geology lab, boys.
So, just in conclusion, San Diego County, California is arguably the most gem pegmatite district in North America. They have plenty of tourmalines and morganites, topazes, you name it. However, America's largest, flawless aquamarine is from Sugar Hill, which is also known as Sugarloaf Mountain here, in Stoneham, Maine. And the best American green and red tourmalines are from Paris, Poland, and Newry. So back in the 19th century, the late 1880s, Maine had few mineralogical rivals. And the barrels we found barrels here, topaz, amethyst, berylinite, and aquamarine. And many of those I was actually able to see down at the Museum of Natural History in New York. Fascinating, fascinating gems. There's some down at Harvard as well. And so it is a very gem-rich area. Not sure we'll find any gems tomorrow, but you can always look, right?
And so why do we see so much beryl? That has beryllium in it, a very small atom. And that's one of those that cracked everything up on top. We pushed it down, we baked it, we made some plutons. And then about 245 million years ago, everything started to change. We weren't smashing together, we started ripping the continent apart. And that was how the Atlantic Ocean formed. We started tearing this big pile of rocks apart. Europe and Africa started to pull away. And that tension of pulling things apart made a lot of cracks through this country, and all this hot magma, this basalt underneath, this oceanic rock got injected in through this countryside. And that's what we're going to see that tomorrow, and you'll see that, like you said, down in Poland along the roadside. That's why we're seeing these basalt dikes shot through the granite around here. It's the origins of the Atlantic Ocean as that pulled away. So I like to think of myself not so much as a mineralogist. I always was much more interested in these big picture things. How do continents collided together? How do we know that? How do we stitch that pattern together? How do we know when it ripped apart? How do we know when that happened? And we'll see and talk a little bit about that as we walk up tomorrow, because we're going to see these basalt dikes cutting across the granite and the pegmatites.
Okay, and that's pretty much it, except that I just wanted to mention some names, local names that we might recognize that might be, that were affiliated with minerals and gems here in Oxford County. Merrill is one, and we'll be near Merrill Farm tomorrow. McAllister, and we have a road named after them off of Route 5. Penfield, Hammond, so you'll see some of these names, and they all are associated. And there are some wonderful references up here. This one, since this was the title of our talk tonight, the Geology of the Pegmatites and Associated Rocks of Maine. This is an old book that's now back in reprint, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful resource. So come up and look at the books. If you're interested in seeing what some of those things, those gems we talked about, you can see them. I flagged them so that you can flip easily to them. There's a beryl, there's a rose quartz, and that sort of thing. So, and then I even have the book by Jane Perham, and of course Maine's treasure chest. So you're welcome to take a look at the books. You're welcome to take a look at the rocks, as long as you feel comfortable doing that. I mean, they should be fine. And I thank you very much for your attention. You guys were great. And the cards, don't worry about those. We can either throw those away, or you could take them home and throw them away, the index cards. And thank you for participating. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, ma'am.